Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Patrick Goggin. I'm with the Extension Lakes team out of the College of Natural Resources at UW-Stevens Point, and I will help host today's partnership initiative stream. Today, we have two combined sessions. We're going to start off with our Wisconsin DNR Surface Water Grants Program, hearing about that, and then we'll transition to another grant opportunity around recreational boating facilities. First up, we have three speakers with us, Allie Mikulyuk, Laura MacFarland, and Alex Delvoye. Alison is an aquatic ecologist and the Lakes and Teams leader with the Wisconsin DNR, and she is their lead person with the Surface Water Grant Program, which many of us use to protect and improve our Wisconsin waters. She is a DNR director of the Lake Leadership Institute, spokesperson for the Wisconsin Lakes Partnership, and occasionally a research scientist when she can fit it in, and dedicated a lot of her life to these ecological principles around water and aquatic systems. Laura is the Wisconsin DNR's Community Finance Surface Water Grant Program Manager. In that role, she administers the financial aspects of the grant program. And before that, she worked in the DNR's environmental grants specialist in the Northwoods, as well as with Trout Unlimited around the UP and northern Wisconsin. And Alex Delvoye is a program assistant with the Wisconsin DNR Surface Water Grant Program in Madison. She assists with the grant intake and ranking process, answers questions for the public and grantees, and helps with improvements to guidance materials and forms. She is also part of the Healthy Lakes and Rivers team and manages the Clean Boats, Clean Waters, and Lake Monitoring and Protection Network's grant programs. So they are going to talk about our Wisconsin DNR Surface Water Grant Program. Please help me welcome, I think first up is Allie.
Hi, everybody, and thank you for that intro, Patrick. Yes, hi, my name is Alison Mikulyuk. Welcome to our presentation on the Surface Water Grant Program. We hope to share with you some useful information that'll help you better understand and participate in this really popular competitive grant program offered by the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources. Patrick already introduced me. I'm Alison. I am a co-lead of this program. I live in Madison, and I help coordinate the Surface Water Program funding decisions and the biologists that you'll work with around the state. And I have two other presenters with me. I'll let them introduce themselves.
I'm Alex Delvoye. I'm a Surface Water Grants Program Assistant, and I'm out of the Madison office, and I assist with the Surface Water Grants Program as a whole.
Great. I'm Laura MacFarland, and as Pat said, I work for the Community Finance, so I help with the financial side of the program. I work very closely with Allie and her team of biologists and manage our environmental grant specialist who assists you with applying for and seeking reimbursement for the grants. And I live up here in Rhinelander.
Yep. So we're all happy to be here with you today. Thanks for attending our presentation. So what are we going to talk about? I'll give you a quick overview of the whole presentation. So we're going to start with a general overview so you kind of understand the purpose of this pot of money that we've been charged by the legislature to use for protection and restoration and AIS control. And then I'm going to go through some of the more specific funding options and projects that you might conceive and support with this program. Then we'll talk a little bit more about how to actually get one of these grants. We'll dive into some of the steps and cover a few grant writing tips. And then finally, we'll leave you with some resources that will empower you to learn more and become a successful applicant, a successful grantee. Yeah, so that's it, a four-part talk today. So first of all, let's talk about the program kind of in a big picture perspective. Grants are available through the Surface Water Grants Program for grassroots organizations and other eligible applicants to conduct surface water management from start to finish. The Surface Water Grant Program is designed to help you access funds to support the great work that you do on a daily basis. Each year, hundreds of lake groups, river organizations, local units of government apply for funding to support a huge range of protection and restoration projects. So today we're going to introduce this program and hopefully empower you to take advantage of it. The Surface Water Grant Program in a nutshell, offers competitive cost-sharing grants for surface water protection and restoration. These grants operate on a reimbursement basis. This year, we had around $6.5 million to commit to projects that protect and restore lakes and watersheds and wetlands and that control aquatic invasive species and prevent their spread. The $6.5 million includes a couple of sources of funding. The majority comes from the Water Resources account of the Conservation Fund. The brass tacks on that is that it's the motorboat fuel tax revenue stream. It's the amount of the tax on the amount of gas we estimate ends up in motorboats. And a second smaller component comes from the Clean Water Act. So the legislature has charged the department in managing this program to use the funds to protect and improve the waters of Wisconsin. You can do this in 3 different ways. There are 3 separate funding sources within the program that support lake projects, river projects, and projects to prevent and control aquatic invasive species. So now that we kind of understand the broad purpose of the program, let's delve a little bit more deeply into the details. The funding options include a number of related grant subprograms. The projects in the program generally fall under 2 main categories. On one side, we have the sort of thinking and planning part of the program. So education, outreach, and planning for management. These projects are designed to help communities understand surface water conditions, to determine their goals and their values, and to develop strategic plans to improve their waters. The other side is the management side. That's the doing part of our program. We protect and improve water quality. We restore shorelines. We control aquatic invasive species, a huge variety of projects for surface water. So, you know, whether your organization is looking for help at the very beginning to organize, to educate, to build your capacity, to drive up membership, that is something that we can help you with, all the way through information gathering, writing a management plan, designing projects, and implementation. So almost wherever you are along your journey, the program can help. So what do you want to do? Within those broader categories of education, planning, and management, there are 7 different sub-programs to consider. It seems kind of complicated, but it's also kind of intended to guide you through the process of lake management. So if you want to get the word out, teach members new skills, develop your capacity or capabilities to do management, seek a $5,000 education grant. If, in fact, you want to assess your water body to better understand it, understand its condition, a surface water planning grant can help, and those are available for up to $10,000. If you want to write a management plan, it's a little bit more holistic in nature to address issues in your watershed. You can also seek a planning grant for up to $25,000. Once you have that plan in place, if you want to implement it, we have funding for lakes up to $200,000, for rivers up to $50,000 for management. There's also a smaller management project that you can implement without a plan. Surface water restoration projects also fit under that management category. So lots of options there. And then finally, we have a program to support permanent land protection. Funding is available to pursue conservation-focused land acquisition and conservation easements. Okay, so that's kind of the lake and river side of the program, but we also have grants available for AIS. So you can get a prevention grant to help stop the spread. You can, if you have an aquatic plant management plan, if you're dealing with aquatic invasive species, for example, you can do an AIS control project. And in addition, we have a couple of newer streamlined programs that Alex is going to tell you about. It's Clean Boats, Clean Waters, and the county programs, the Lake Monitoring and Protection Network.
Awesome. So to start out with Clean Boats, Clean Waters, or CBCW, wanted to highlight that because it's one of Wisconsin's flagship AIS prevention programs. You may have noticed Clean Boats, Clean Waters volunteers checking boats at local boat landings, and those boat inspectors help to perform boat and trailer checks hand out informational brochures, and educate voters on how to prevent the spread of aquatic invasive species. CBCW grants are non-competitive, which means that all applications from eligible applicants submitted by the deadline are funded. The grants can be used to help fund the inspectors staffing the landings, and the program itself is continuously growing in popularity and is the Surface Water Grant Program's most popular grant. This summer alone, we'll have 296 landings being monitored across 160 grants around the state. Next slide. The Lake Monitoring and Protection Network Program, or the LMPN for short, is one of the newest grants under the Surface Water Grant Program, eligible for counties and their designated agents. The overall goal of the LMPN grants is to provide a consistent base of funding for core water protection services statewide, which will in turn reduce the occurrence of new invasions in Wisconsin. These core services can include things like coordinating the Clean Boats, Clean Waters trainings, implementing the Purple Loosestrife biocontrol program, coordinating early detection monitoring for AIS, providing outreach and education to partners and AIS stakeholders, and several more activities. Before this year, this was part of the AIS Education Prevention and Planning Program used to fund those AIS coordinator positions. There were some issues with funding AIS coordinator grants under the old model because it led to inconsistent funding if a grant application happened to rank too low or there wasn't enough AIS funding to go around the state. This led to some gaps in coverage or years where a county may not have the funding to employ that AIS coordinator position when the grant was not awarded. The funding under the LMPN should be much more predictable since the grants are non-competitive and they don't get ranked. The program allocates around $1 million between all the counties to fund AIS coordinator positions at either a county level or a kind of a multi-county regional level when counties work together. Next slide. And I wanted to highlight this map of the new LMPN grants, which are in a solid color on the map, and then our remaining AEPP grants, which are in shown with diagonal lines. We're currently in a transition phase between our old program and the new grants. So we have both types of grants running right now until the old program's phased out. As you can see, many counties have an AIS coordinator that you can reach out to, and they're great local resources for AIS related issues. And I'll post a link to find that contact information for those folks in the chat in a few seconds. Next slide. Now that you've learned a little more about the grants within the Surface Water Grant Program, you may have a better idea with what you would like to do with them. And now we'll kind of dive into how you can get a grant. Next slide.
Great, thank you, Allie and Alex. Yeah, so I guess I would like to emphasize before I dive into this third point that all of these resources are available on our website, and we'll show you the link to that website at the end of the PowerPoint. However, because we're going to cover a lot of information here, so we're just going to kind of cover what is the first steps now that you know kind of what in general you can fund with these grants. What is the first steps in acquiring a grant or securing a grant? So next slide, please. So you really do want to start early. And that's why we give these presentations now, because although our deadline isn't until November, our final grant deadline isn't until November, there are several things you have to do sooner rather than later. The first being is to determine your eligibility as an organization. The second is to work closely with your partners to develop your project. And the third is to apply or to submit a pre-application on September 2nd. So we'll go into these details a little bit further. Next slide, please. All right. It's really important that you understand our grant cycle timeline, because there really are 3 deadlines I'd like to emphasize. While the final application, like I said, isn't due for another 8 months. The process for applying for funding really begins in May, or at least 6 months prior. By May 1st, we encourage you to confirm your eligibility with your environmental grant specialist. This is to ensure that your bylaws are up to code, that you meet the requirements under code. And if there's any steps that you need to take to secure eligibility prior to November 1st, you have plenty of time to do so. And then second deadline really here to emphasize is the pre-proposals, like I said, are due to September 2nd. And last but not least, our grant application is November 2nd. So let's step through this process a little bit. Next slide, please. So confirming your organization's eligibility. We do have a new eligibility application form. So if you've never applied for a surface water grant before, we'll encourage you to touch base with the environmental grant specialist to learn more about this. Next slide, we'll talk a little bit about what kind of organizations are and are not eligible. If your organization meets the criteria of any of those listed in the above table, you're automatically eligible. Although if you have any doubts, I encourage you to reach out to your environmental grant specialist. However, if your organization is listed below in the second table, you must apply. And like I said, I encourage you to reach out to your EGS soon. Even if you have received a grant in the past, even if you've been deemed eligible in the past, please reach out to them. Many of our eligible organizations were deemed eligible a decade, 2 decades ago. And we do need to ensure that if that's the case, that you reapply to make sure that your bylaws or articles of incorporation meet the requirements outlined in state code and statute. So the next slide's a little overwhelming, but I just want to emphasize that all this information, you can go to the next slide, please. All this information is available in our program guidance on our website and on the application for eligibility, which you'll find under the Apply tab on our website. So there are many ways in which you can qualify as an eligible entity, and those are all outlined on the website. So I'm not going to go through each line individually. Next slide, please. All right, in addition to ensuring that your organization is eligible, it is also important early on to ensure that you have the support of your governing body or your governing board, and that the board has designated an authorized representative to apply for a grant, to accept a grant, and to manage a grant from the state of Wisconsin. So we have on our website a sample resolution available to you. It's also found within Appendix J of the guidance, and this will be submitted with your application. But I encourage you to check this out early after you determine that you're eligible to receive a grant, and walk through this with your board to make sure you guys are all on the same page in pursuing a grant from the state. All right, next slide.
Okay, so now that we've covered some of the first steps that you'll take to ensure eligibility for a grant, we're going to talk a little bit about how you might develop a project and actually complete the application side. So first, you'll need to outline your ideas. But before you get started, it's always a good idea to reach out and identify local entities that are aligned with your purpose. That includes other nonprofits or other groups. If you're a lake organization, maybe reaching out to a farmer-led council in your area. There's the UW Extension, your local biologists and environmental grant specialists for sure. But if you reach out and identify folks who might be working in your same direction, that can really pay dividends in the long run. Surface water management challenges are large and incredibly complex. And sometimes the more relationships that you have with other people, the better your ability will be to meet these challenges. Oftentimes, to solve problems in a lake, we need to look upstream or look at the watershed, and that requires collaboration, communication, and partnerships. So make sure you make contact with any partners that you can, and you can start to then outline your ideas. If you really don't know where to start, your DNR staff can help you decide on some of those first steps. So feel free to reach out to them early to talk around some of the ideas. They could have some advice for you. And then developing the project has two main components. First, you want to kind of get your basic rough draft down in the form of a pre-application. Then you'll work to revise and refine that pre-application as you move forward toward the November 1st final deadline. So let's talk first about that pre-application. That's the first real formal step you'll be taking with respect to applying. Most applicants, save for, some returning Healthy Lakes grantees, for example, most applicants need to submit this pre-app in order to be eligible for funding. But what is a pre-application? It's essentially a rough draft of your grant application. It's really intended just to be a kind of a sketch of your ideas. You do not need staff approval prior to submission of your pre-application. A lot of people can kind of worry about the pre-app step, that it will prevent them from getting a grant, if they don't do well on the pre-application. You still need to have an eligible project to actually get a grant, but the quality of your pre-application has nothing to do with the final decision. It's really just a process that's designed to help us provide you feedback. So don't worry about the content at that stage. You don't need to, do a lot of back and forth with your biologist to get the pre-app in ship shape. It's good to be detailed so your biologist understands where you're headed, but it's important to realize that it's completely separate from the grant funding decisions. It's really just to connect you to local assistance. And with that, it's important to know also, the summer is a pretty busy time for all of us. It's you don't have to dump a lot of time into the pre-app. We understand that leading up to September is, it's the season for lakes, right? So same for our biologists. You might not get a lot of back and forth in feedback prior to September. So that's how, like the pre-app is really intended to start that conversation. So submit that and then go from there. After September 2nd, then your biologist will kind of get an idea of where you're headed, and then may call a meeting to discuss the application, to provide feedback, and to help you revise and refine it and make it eligible if necessary. So when we're in that phase of refining and revising, that's when we're going to start to work that pre-application up into a final application that will be reviewed by the program to see if it merits funding. And it is a highly competitive program. That said, we are very proud to support grassroots organizations as well as professional tier groups. But grant writing is a skill, and it takes people years to develop the skill. And I know I can't give you all of the answers in this short time, but I would like to cover 4 major areas that I noticed over the years that kind of relate to an application falling short. So first of all, applications can have issues of alignment. They can score poorly, basically because they don't match the program priorities that have been defined in guidance. Your lake streams and AIS biologist is keyed into these priorities, and they can be a great resource to let you know if you're kind of on the right track, to suggest a project that we've been charged by the legislature to fund. Your goal is to strive for a project that authentically meets those funding priorities that are published in guidance. It's always a really good idea to review the ranking sheets, and you can find that in the applicant guide in program guidance, and that can really help you understand on a very concrete level what the rankers will be looking for from an application. And second, applications sometimes fail due to lack of specificity. Third, there's leaving out information, and fourth is a failure in not being concise. So let's step through those qualities. First, about being concise, you have to recognize that, unfortunately, the rankers don't have infinite time, and we get a lot of applications. So being concise and specific together is really what can help you kind of rise to the top. presenting a wall of words sometimes buries the positive aspects of your application. So one kind of rule of guideline would be to follow the rule of threes. If you're making a list, limit it to 3 items. Structure your paragraphs with kind of like 3 main topics. Clearly organized thoughts are simply easier for rankers to understand, comprehend, and notice. On the slide, there's kind of an example of how you might structure a project summary very clearly with 3 main purposes: the central purpose, the primary objectives, and the anticipated outcome. Taking that kind of systematic approach to writing, I think, is a really good skill for any person who's looking to write a grant application. So important to be concise, but almost counterintuitively, it's also important to be specific. You need to include the important details with clear and concise writing. If you lay out your plans in detail, the project will seem realistic and well thought out, and it will seem likely to be successful and thus merit funding. Note the appearance of quantities, targets, timelines are all kind of elements of specificity that are important to include. Sometimes if you step back and you look at your application, you can ask, did I answer who, what, when, where, why, and how? Then you probably have told a rich and compelling technical story. Walking the line between being concise and detailed, I think, in my opinion, is the most difficult part of grant writing. It's a heavy lift, but with practice, you can learn to write clearly and specifically. SMART goals and objectives, you can kind of Google that if you want to learn a little bit about writing better goals and objectives. It's good feedback, good guideline. Okay, and then 4th, we've got this idea of leaving points on the table, sometimes people say, but it's basically leaving out important information. The DNR is one agency, but the way that the grant program functions, we make our funding decisions independently of the people that helped you develop your project. That's so that our program can maintain objectivity. That's one reason anyways. So you need to assume that rankers have no knowledge of your project. They've never heard of you, they've never heard of the work that you're doing, and they haven't really heard of all of the work that brought you to this point, unless you find a way to tell them. So, we review over 200 applications a year, and rankers really need to be drawn through all of the steps. That said, you can't include everything. That's the rule of being concise. You should include any points you think will help them review your project. Definitely include points that are in the ranking sheet, but don't assume that they already know. Okay, that wraps it up for my section on grant writing tips, I think, Laura.
Great, fantastic. So now let's talk a little bit about developing your budget. Again, all this information is available in our guidance, which I strongly encourage you to review, but you're gonna wanna ask yourself these following questions for each and every line item within the budget, whether it's purchased or it's donated. We have a list of eligible and ineligible items within guidance. You also want to be aware of budget category caps. For example, only 10% of the grant total may be spent on direct administration costs, and no more than 20% of planning grants can be spent on education activities. So there's just a couple examples of cost caps. You also want to note that Healthy Lakes and Rivers and Clean Boats, Clean Waters grants, as well as land acquisition grants, they all have unique eligible expenses. So you want to make sure that you take heed of that and you're paying attention to what is eligible under which sub-program. All costs must be incurred within the grant period. There are a few exceptions to the rule, and if you have questions, as you know, you can seek clarification with your local environmental grant specialist. But in general, most costs must be incurred between the start date and the end date of your agreement. The start dates of our agreement is March 15th following your application. And typically our grants run anywhere from 1 to 3 years, depending on the scope of your project, with the end date being on December 31st. Also, there are 2 additional policies to be aware of when you're drafting the budgets. And these policies exist to ensure that we are maximizing the potential of our limited funding. As Ali said, these are very competitive programs, and we're really hoping to stretch our dollars to benefit the Wisconsin's water resources. So first off, only the proportional share of costs or items that are partially used for your project may be included in the budget. So for example, if you're going to purchase a large piece of equipment that will cost $10,000, only the proportional share of cost for that item is eligible. So if your grant is 3 years long, only 30% or 10 years divided by 3, only 30% of that cost would be eligible for reimbursement. Second of all, a grantee must implement cost containment measures for all capital assets, any supply, service, and equipment items purchased by a grantee for projects funded with a grant if the cost exceeds $2,500. So again, you must take measures to stretch out your dollars, if you will. And all that is in guidance on what qualifies as a cost containment measure and what applies. And then last but not least, a professional service agreement is required if you hire a consultant or a third-party service provider at a cost of excess $5,000. So basically, this PSA is required at the time of commencement of work, not at time of application. However, we encourage you to start thinking about these things now. A PSA can often be used as a tool to capture costs from consultants when preparing your budget. And it's important to note that the purpose of the PSA is to ensure that both parties, you and your service provider, understand the scope of services and the costs associated with the project. You'll submit the all signed professional service agreements at the request for final payment, but do not wait till the end to ensure that you have a PSA. The primary benefit of the PSA is recourse by the grantee in the event that the consultant did substandard work or incomplete work, because ultimately you as the grantee are the ones who will be put in a tough spot if the work has been done, you've paid the bills, and the DNR cannot reimburse you because the work was substandard or incomplete. So these are just a few things to keep in mind while developing your budget. Again, reach out to your environmental grant specialist if you have any questions.
So after revising, refining your application, and finalizing your budget, it comes time to submit your final application by November 1st.
All right, and this requires you to fill out an application form describing your project in detail. Grant applications are due November 1st, and the application can be found online at the Surface Water Grant website. You can find this quickly on Google if you search WDNR Surface Water Grants. We're also an exhibitor. You can find links there as well if you want to check that out. Next slide. So in order to submit your application materials, you can either email them or mail them to us. Email is by far the preferred method of submittal. The application map and authorizing resolution are kind of universally required as application materials across grant types. Other grants may require additional materials, or you may need to submit documents depending on how you fill out the form. The attachment section in the application should clue you in to what materials are required and will update based on how the application is filled out. And this could include things like design plans, land use agreements, state lab cost forms, or other documents as well. Next slide. And then after applications have been reviewed and ranked, applicants are notified via email when grant awards are announced around mid-February. Your authorized representative will receive a grant award via email. It's absolutely necessary that everyone who's involved in the management of the grant carefully review the terms and conditions of the grant agreement prior to the grant being accepted. And this award would then be signed and returned to your environmental grant specialist within 30 days. The funds will then be encumbered. Next slide. All right, and if all of this information has you interested in applying for a grant, there's a number of resources that are available to you. Next slide. The information we've talked about can be found on the Surface Water Grants website or in the Applicant Guidance document to review in further detail. The guidance document is a long document, but it's extremely useful, and it contains a lot of information on the grants available, how to apply, project management after a grant is awarded. I'd recommend also signing up for GovDelivery if you want updates on the program, or you can also reach out to questions on the grant program to the DNR Surface Water Grants email inbox. Next slide. And then we'll close out this presentation with a reminder that you have a team of really awesome folks on hand to help you out too. You can reach out to your environmental grant specialist, your local or your regional biologist, Laura, Alison, and I, who coordinate the statewide program from Madison. You could send questions to any one of us. Next slide. Thank you, everyone.